In this Magic the Gathering draft guide, I will be covering the key information you need to know before diving into your first draft. I will be discussing what is draft, the draft basics you need to know, and strategy for beginners who are just getting started with draft. First up, what is draft? In draft, 8 players open 3 packs each and draft cards one at a time. They use these cards, along with basic lands, to build 40 card decks. In draft, you're going to be using a lot of commons and uncommons because that's what makes up the bulk of packs. So cards like Grizzly Bears, which are 2-mana 2/2s, usually with upside these days, are staples in the draft format. Bigger creatures like Air Elemental and nice removal spells like Lightning Strike to interact with your opponent's creatures are absolutely the sort of cards you're going to be playing draft in and draft out. So if you like playing a little bit of toned down Magic, not just playing with the best few rares and mythics from each set, draft is going to be a lot of fun for you because you really get to play with a lot more of the cards in each set. Draft is a format based around creatures and combat. You play with cards of all rarities and utilize both deck building and gameplay skills, so the format is very replayable, very skill testing, and a whole lot of fun. Let's dive into how the drafting actually works. The first thing you're going to do is open a pack and select one card. So you'll open your pack, look through, and then choose the card that you most want to play in your deck. Next, you will pass the pack to the person next to you. Then you will pick a card from the pack that was passed to you, and then you will repeat steps 2 and 3. So you'll pick a card, pass the pack, pick a card, pass the pack, pick a card, pass the pack. And because every player is doing that, the packs will slowly have less and less cards in them, and then you'll eventually run out of cards in the first pack. Then you'll open a new pack, select a card, pass it, select a card, pass it, and you do that until you've gone through 3 packs. Once you've done that, you will build a 40 card deck. So it's not like Constructed where you're building a 60 card deck. It's not like Commander where you're building a 100 card deck. This is draft, and so you will build a 40 card deck. You will be using 23 spells from cards you drafted, and it's worth noting that you will usually want to stick to 2 colors when you're drafting, and you will want to include plenty of creatures. You'll definitely want to include 13 or more creatures when you're starting. Usually around that 15 mark is generally a good baseline to aim for because creatures are the building blocks of draft. And when you're just getting started, you don't really want to deviate from that because it'll just lead to non-games where you don't really get to participate. You will also use 17 lands to fill out the remainder of your 40 card deck. Basic lands are provided, so you don't need to draft them. But if you do draft a special land in the course of the draft, you are allowed to play that. And a 9/8 mana base is quite common. So if you don't draft any lands, just building a mana base purely of basic lands is quite common. So you don't need to feel bad about that at all. So that is the basics of draft. Now let's cover some strategy for beginners. Now that you know, okay, you're going to be drafting cards that you want, you're going to be building a 40 card deck, how can you actually build a functional deck? So here's what we'll cover now. First of all, we're going to talk about reading signals, which is really the key aspect of the drafting portion that you need to know. In this scenario, let's just assume that you are getting passed cards by player A. Player A drafts black-green. Let's just say that they see a lot of really good black and green cards in the draft. They decide they want to build that deck. They are going to be drafting black and green, and they are passing to you. So what should you do? If you are being passed to by someone who's drafting black-green, what would an optimal scenario be? Well, maybe playing something like a blue-white deck would be optimal. And the reason for this is if you're getting passed to by someone playing black-green, they're not going to take any of the cards you are interested in. They will pass you all of the good blue cards, all of the good white cards. And so instead of just having to rely on opening good blue and white cards, you're also going to be getting passed whatever good blue and white cards player A is opening. So that is a really nice place to be. It's much worse if you also draft a black-green deck right next to the person who is drafting black-green, because then you're just getting the second best card from every pack, because they're going to take the best black or green card, and then they'll pass it to you, and you'll get the second best black or green card. So if you want to draft a good deck and have a successful draft, you really want to avoid drafting the colors of the person passing to you. Now, how can you actually do this in practice? Well, first up, you have to have an open mind. If you go into the draft saying, I'm going to draft black-green, and then the person next to you does the same thing, you're going to get in that awkward spot where you're just getting the second best card out of every pack. So you need to be willing to draft whatever color pair you are seeing, whichever strong cards you're seeing. So that's the first step. It's almost a pre-step, if you will, because it happens even before you sit down at the draft table. The next thing you need to do is identify strong cards, which happens automatically to some degree. The cards you want to put in your deck are the strong cards. So when you're looking at every pack and determining what card to take, if you're just taking the strong cards, you're generally going to be doing that anyway. But it's also worth noting the strong cards that you aren't able to take and things like that, because the strong cards are the cards you want to put in your deck overall. So if you're getting past strong cards in a certain color, you'll want to notice that. Speaking of which, look for trends. If you keep getting past strong blue cards and strong white cards, then and not seeing a lot of strong black and green cards, then maybe that's a good indication that you should be drafting blue-white instead of black-green. This is particularly important when you are drafting, because you should not just look for individual strong cards. The trend aspect is actually really good, because maybe there was a pack that had 2 really good white cards, and if you just see one good white card and then say, oh, white must be open, that's another way to fall into a trap. So identify strong cards and then look for trends over time and keep that open mind throughout this whole process. And then remain flexible for the first few picks. When you're new to draft, I recommend 5 as a good number. It's not that overwhelming to stay open for the first 5 picks. You're not going to train wreck. You're definitely going to end up with enough playables, even if you do stay flexible and maybe not get to play a few of your first picks. But it also keeps things simple for you. And as you get better at draft, you'll be able to stay open longer and longer and build better decks and read more and more signals. Now that we've covered a little bit of the draft portion strategy, I want to talk about the mana curve, because this is important not only for the draft portion, but especially for the deck building portion. This is the sort of type of thing that a mana curve means. You've got your 2 mana plays, your 3 mana plays, 4 mana plays, 5 mana plays, 6 mana plays, and you generally want to have more cheap plays versus more expensive plays, because spending your mana every turn in draft is absolutely critical if you don't want to fall behind, if you want to actually pull ahead of your opponents, and things like that. So prioritizing cheap plays is critical. You can play 1-drops too. They just are not in this picture, because it's really just about this general shape versus the exact ratios that you see here. The mana curve, important thing to know. Aim for 6 or more 2-drops. You really basically can't have too many 2-drops. They're very important. If you have a 2-drop on turn 2, it's almost like par for the course in draft. If your opponent has one and you don't have one, you're far behind in a lot of cases. And generally, this should be something you aim for. So just make sure you have a good number of 2-drops so that you can get and affect the board early in the game. Another thing you need to know about the mana curve is that you will naturally get 3 and 4 drops, so you don't really need to prioritize them in the same way that you need to prioritize 2 drops. The middle part of your curve tends to fill itself out naturally. You don't need to be like, oh, I really need a 3 drop here to fill out my mana curve. You'll probably have an opportunity to pick up a 3 or 4 mana play that is relatively replaceable, and that you don't need to prioritize those ones. You need to be very selective with cards that cost 5 or more, because those cards are not going to get deployed until later in the game. And so even if one looks powerful, you need to be thinking, well, if I draw a couple of these, I won't be able to do anything for quite some time. And so you need to be very selective with the cards you play that are expensive, and make sure that they are going to be overall worthwhile, because if you take a expensive card early, like first pick a 5 mana play, then it limits what you can do later on in the draft, where if you start seeing good 5 or 6 mana plays later on and you don't have enough 2-drops, you might have to take a worse 2-drop over that 6 mana play. So the mana curve, it's really important to prioritize those cheap plays, and when in doubt, take or play the cheaper card. So if you're in the draft portion and choosing between a 2-drop that you like and a 4-drop you like, generally it's best to just default to taking the 2-drop, especially when you're new. Having these sorts of defaults is going to help you keep things simple. And then when deciding which card to play in your final deck, if you're choosing between playing another 2-drop or playing a 4-drop, often choosing to play that cheaper card is going to be really nice for your mana curve. So that's another key part of the drafting process, is building your decks with a mana curve. And then some final tips I wanted to cover, the first of which is premium removal is important in draft, so it is often worth prioritizing. Since you don't get to just put whichever cards you want into your deck, having ways to interact with your opponent's creatures and kill problematic cards is quite important. I say premium removal here because just because a card says destroy target creature or something like that doesn't mean it's necessarily worth playing. But some things to keep in mind is, like, if it says destroy anything and it costs like 3 mana, that's generally going to be something you're going to want to play. Or 2 mana ways that are like efficiently going to kill medium to small creatures. Those are generally the sorts of cards you want to prioritize, because you don't have unlimited access to those. And you can oftentimes find a replacement level creature, like just a mediocre card that's like has stats, but having a removal spell and just making sure you have those is important. And then the final tip that I have for you is have a plan while drafting and deck building. This is something you will get better at over time, but just having a general thing that you're trying to do, like I want to draft a deck that attacks my opponent quickly, is a game plan in and of itself, and then making sure your cards line up with that game plan. So maybe not just putting a clunky card draw spell into your deck when all you're trying to do is attack, Or maybe your game plan is, I want to stall the game and win in the late game. And so in those decks, you don't want a card that has to attack or that can't block or things like that. Just make sure your deck has a cohesive game plan and that your cards slot into that game plan. And that is something you will improve at over time, but it is something I wanted to mention here. Anyway, that is going to do it for this guide. I wanted to say thank you so much for watching. Remember to hit the like button, subscribe for more, and comment if you have any questions or feedback, and leave hashtag #NewDrafter to let me know you made it to the end of the video. I really hope you found this helpful. I hope you give draft a shot, and I will talk to you next time.